I'm Felicia Tomasko. I'm here with LMU's Center for Religion and Spirituality. And this is a discussion in the series, Yoga in Our Time. I'm thrilled to be here today with Sharon Suh, who's a professor of Buddhism in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Seattle University. She received her Ph.D. in Buddhist Studies from Harvard University and is the author of several articles and book chapters on Buddhism, gender, and race. She's published 3 books: Being Buddhist in a Christian World, Gender and Community, Silver Screen Buddha, Buddhism in Asian and Western Film, and Occupy This Body, a Buddhist Memoir. Her academic work explores the intersections of Buddhism, gender, race, and film. She's particularly interested in exploring trauma from the perspectives of Buddhism and neuroscience, and focuses particularly on experiences of women of color. She emphasizes the importance of trauma-informed embodiment practices, such as meditation and yoga, that can increase the capacity for resilience. So I could go on and on about your bio and your background, but just to say that your accomplishments as a practitioner, as a professor, as a scholar, as a teacher are vast, and we're honored, at LMU at the Center for Religion and Spirituality, that you're speaking with us today, and that you're also going to be speaking in the Yoga Mindfulness and Social Change program about mindful eating and compassionate living. So thank you so much, Sharon.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here and really excited about your program too. I wish we had one of those at CLU, so thanks.
Maybe this will inspire it. I think these intersection, and this is so much of what your life work is about, this intersection of mindfulness, social change, yoga, these practices, and what they really mean in the modern world is so essential. And what you're going to be teaching, mindful eating, is also part of the journey of your personal story, which you talk about in your book, Occupy This Body, a Buddhist Memoir. And what are some of the things that have helped you to create shifts in your personal journey around finding a mindful path to food and eating? Because you've shared your family background and how that hasn't always been easy.
Yeah. Well, I definitely do come from a long background of food-related trauma in my family. I was raised in New York, and my parents were Korean immigrants. And so my mom suffered from a lot of undiagnosed mental health issues and eating disorders. And so I grew up with this inability to decide for myself how hungry I was. Mm-hmm. And so as a child, and even as I grew up into a teenager and a young adult, I really never knew how to read the cues of my own body, because my mom was always overriding my ability to decide when I wanted to eat and when I didn't. And so I really didn't understand how to feed myself in a way that was supporting my own hunger and my own really physical cues for hunger and satisfaction and satiety. So, and I get into this in my book, my mom was anorexic and bulimic, and so she refrained from feeding herself and did the opposite, of course, with me, which was to force feed me. And it really overrode my ability to even know if I was hungry. And so that definitely impacted how I understood myself, my body, being in connection with my physical self. And so, as I matured, I came to realize that there's got to be a different way, right? Because food was always something that, I love to eat. I've always loved to cook, but at the same time, I always recognized that when I was feeling anxious or stressed, I would often, that would manifest often in my relationship to food and how I fed myself. And over the course of time, I came across this great book by one of my teachers, Jan Chosen Bays, who's a wonderful Zen Buddhist priest and a physician. And she wrote this amazing book called Mindful Eating. And I came across it in a bookstore when there used to be a Barnes and Noble. And I can't believe I'm saying that I'm yearning for that too, because that has disappeared. But I remember just going down the aisles and when we used to do that, and I picked up this book on mindful eating, and it was the first time I ever found something that connected Buddhist with infant trauma. And like most things, and I think if you just look at my CV, you find that if I'm interested in something, I tend to do a deep dive. And so I found this book, and I just realized that there was an entirely different way that I could be in relationship to food and my body. And so I met Jan and ended up doing a mindful eating, conscious living training with her over the course of 4 years, and learning both how to really establish this kind of intuitive understanding of my body and how to care for it, as well as learning how to invite others into this kind of practice that I personally have found to be really beneficial and helped me develop some joy around food, right? In our culture, food is so, it can be for some people really anxiety producing when people don't know what to eat, how much to eat, and food has become good food, bad food. And it's really all this external noise. And what I've learned through mindful eating is that you learn to take care of the internal, right, and decide for yourself, as opposed to all these external forces, telling you what you should or shouldn't do. That's been one of the most beneficial and I would say liberating things for me, and allowing me to develop this kind of joyful relationship to food. I can go on forever.
Yeah, I love how you talked about the joyful relationship to food, because sometimes when we might hear mindful, that might sound very serious as well. And how do we have a relationship that's both mindful and joyful and very intentional? And I think what you've described is something that a lot of people can relate to, whether it's cognitive distortions around relationships with food and the body, whether it is this overriding or lack of attention paid to understanding the physical signaling of the body. What are some ways that people can begin to start on the path or the journey of healing? What are some steps when, like yourself, they may not have been able to understand or listen or be aware of those physical signals?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, just I think there's a tendency to assume that any kind of changes that we make have to happen right away, else they're not real changes. And so I start with my students are really basic practices, like recognizing that, we have in our body to hunger. We usually think about hunger as just a physical thing, but it's also an emotional element, or hunger. And there's ways in which we can learn how to recognize when we're physically hungry, hungry. There's all these different sometimes I'm hungry for something that might not actually be satisfied by food, but I'm so conditioned from my past behavior to reach for food, feeling maybe lonely or feeling stressed. We all do this, and I still do it, and it's perfectly okay to do the kind of hand to mouth. And sometimes that's perfectly reasonable, as long as you recognize that you're doing it and you actually make that choice. So I think that if you're being a mindful eater, you're a perfect eater. And I am by no means, I don't know what that is actually, to be a perfect eater. Part of the recognition is that it's not a diet plan, right? And it's not a nutrition plan. It has no food, but it has far more to do with your relationship to it. So learning how to recognize, and we do these very basic exercises. Learning to ask your stomach how hungry it is. That's something I never learned as a kid. I never learned as an adult. And so I would to discover like, oh, I'm hungry. I would just check the time, be like, oh, is it lunchtime? And then check and see like, well, what am I supposed to eat? You know, what is the prevailing wisdom around food these days? And it changes all the time, right? And so some of the more basic things are just learning how to ask yourself, like, how hungry are you right now? You know, starving, half full, 3/4 full, and how much would be satisfied with? Just begin to ask those kinds of questions can be a really wonderful way to learn to take better care of ourselves, because this question is really about, learning how to take care of ourselves in a nourishing kind of way, and also learning how to cultivate joy and letting go of food-related guilt, which I think a lot of people suffer from. And in my practice of mindfulness, my teaching of mindfulness as a kind of political and recuperative strategy, as a woman of I refuse to not feel joy, right? The capacity to feel joy around food is one element of joy. There's other areas in my life where I can talk about serious things and I can be very critical about at the same time. The capacity to allow ourselves to feel joy is actually something really beneficial and important, especially in the climate that we're living in right now, where certainly as an Asian American woman, in the pandemic, there's ways in which I felt really hyper visible and hyper invisible. And there's ways in which that constant onslaught and back to deal with, the association of our bodies with contagion, it can be. And so finding ways to cultivate mindfulness so that we can feel joy, right? That to me is the beneficial elements of mindful eating.
Well, and it's so important you bring up some key issues, because we're also speaking during Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where, bringing attention to the invisible becomes, I think, even more important. And for you as an Asian American, and you speak about this even in your family life, what are some of the challenging messages around relationship to food and body image and health and wellness? And how can some of the, Buddhist practices and yoga practices help to shift that, help to be part of healing, help to find joy?
Yeah, that's like another book project right there. I mean, I can speak for myself and just what I've experienced, for example, within Korean culture and Korean American culture is this tremendous kind of expectation that's placed on our bodies culturally, that we look a certain way, that our bodies are disciplined into being, smaller and soft and, all of these things that are really disciplinary practices on our bodies. And at the same time, I've heard this message so many times for women, like especially Asian American women or Asian women in general, like, don't get fat. Okay, that's a huge, and it's not just particular to Asian American women, of course, but this kind of cultural expectation that you do not get fat, but you better eat everything that I give you, right? So there's that really impossible relationship that so many people suffer from, but we never talk about. And so this cultural expectation on the one hand that you respect your elders, and one of the ways to do that is to, if someone's giving you food, you eat it as an expression of love and as an expression of gratitude, and for being a good Confucian child, right, or daughter. You respect your elders. So if they're piling food on your plate, and they're going to, because that's a symbol of love too, then you certainly have to eat it. But by the way, don't get fat. So it's an impossible kind of relationship. And I think there's a lot of ways in which that pressure can lead to this really debilitating sense of self and self-worth, especially if your body doesn't naturally fit into that paradigm, right? Which is a construct. And yet, if we don't fit it, then we feel out of alignment, right? And that could, everyone in the yoga world talks about alignment all the time, and this kind of physical alignment, but also there's a way in which we can feel out of alignment even with our own cultural norms. And so I think in many ways, Buddhist practice is really helpful because it allows us to see a lot of the cultural conditioning and the habits we've formed around even how we think about ourselves, how we think about our bodies. We tend to look at our bodies from the outside in, and mindfulness allows us to kind of explore what's going on internally and find that resilience and learn how to trust your gut. Like I spend a lot of time in my classes, both in the university setting, but also in my mindfulness classes, talking about neuroscience and how in many ways when we've been traumatized, we really don't feel so much of our body. And we tend to look at ourselves from the outside in. And yet, when we learn to be aware and mindful of how we experience anger, how we experience anxiety, how we experience stress, those things show up in our bodies first, right? We tend to think that these emotions of sadness and anger and joy are up here. Right. But they're in here first. And so I'm always encouraging people to really trust their gut. Like when you feel that there's a tightening in your chest, before your mind even knows what that emotion is, I always encourage people to really trust their gut because, your gut is your second brain, but there's an internal wisdom to the physical self that we, especially in academics, have been taught to override and not pay attention to, right? So there's so much wisdom in this incredible container that we have, but we tend to not listen because we think we should be listening to whatever the prevailing knowledge is on the outside. But when you're not in alignment with that and it doesn't feel right, I always encourage my students to trust the gut first. Yeah.
Well, and like you said, you pointed to your heart, but as you said, the gut is the second brain, the home of our enteric nervous system. So it is about what we feel and retraining that if it has been trained out of a person, like your personal example of being taught to not listen to the signals of the gut or the body, or not listen to cues of hunger or anything else. And you're speaking from your personal experience as an Asian American, as a woman, as someone whose family is Korean, but as practitioners of yoga who come from different family backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, different histories, how can we support one another on this journey where there's going to be different kinds of trauma, but for different reasons with different stories, we may have been discouraged to listen to the gut. And how can we use the practices of yoga and mindfulness and Buddhist techniques, some of which may have also been co-opted to proliferate images of the body that may not be helpful, right? How can we collectively shift that and support each other?
Yeah, that's such an important question. And, divesting from the ways in which yoga and mindfulness has been used to uphold a kind of white supremacy or white supremacist kind of capitalist notion of the ideal body. That's there. It's in all of our yoga studios. And at the same time, I'm unwilling to get rid of the practice because the practice itself is so valuable, but it's the ways that practice has been co-opted and appropriated, right, to support a kind of a upper middle class white body aesthetic, for example, a cisgendered white body aesthetic. That's the thing, right? In the wellness industry, and we see this everywhere. And the kind of exoticization and the history of Orientalism and colonialism around yoga, it has narrowed the vision of what we imagine yoga to be, to focus on this one little image. And that image is just a tiny image, but it's so powerful. And so I actually haven't been going to any yoga studios lately, and it's not just because of COVID, but part of it is because there's a way in which one can go into a yoga studio that's not trauma informed. And, you know, there's so many yoga studios that are populated with upper middle class, very flexible white women. And I think this practice can be very empowering for them, but to move into that space as an Asian American woman, I never feel like I fit. And there's really no effort to be that inclusive, because there's this sense that, you know, you go into a yoga studio, there's these asanas and sequences you have to do, and you have to have this body that can do those things, or work really hard to get to that point. And then when you get there along the way, you're kind of patted on the back for your success. And I don't think yoga is really about success. Right? And so all of the ways I understand yoga now are so different in terms of recognizing if I go into a yoga studio and if I'm teaching a yoga class, I assume that everybody in that room has experienced some form of trauma, right? And if they haven't, I certainly have. And so the way I teach, right? The way I teach is through a trauma-informed lens, which is not about progress. It's not about that kind of keep doing this and eventually you'll attain that very, very small body aesthetic, right? That's not something that I'm interested in. I'm more interested in people recognizing that when they practice, I don't care if they do what I tell them to do. And then the basis of trauma-informed yoga and mindfulness, right, is choice-making capacity. Right. So I've done some work with Yoga Behind Bars, and this is an incredible organization that was started in Washington that brings yoga to incarcerated people, but more importantly, actually trains incarcerated folks to be yoga teachers so that they can practice with folks behind bars. And it's the choice-making capacity that's the most important thing. So if you inhale, you know, you might go into a regular studio and you're told, inhale, you know, reach your hands up, exhale, forward fold. We know the script. We're told to memorize the script. But nowhere in that memorization is there an opportunity for people to decide for themselves whether or not they want to do that, right? And anytime you say no, anytime you make a different choice, that builds that choice-making capacity. And if trauma is something that's happened to us for which we had no choice, then anytime that we can choose to open our eyes or close our eyes, choose to lay down in a shavasana or not, right? Anytime we can exercise those choice-making capacities, we can develop resilience and heal from past trauma. I mean, it's not an easy process, and I don't know that there's ever a point when you have completely healed, but I do think that there's very small yet powerful things that we could do, even when we use our voice, our language. When you're ready, if you'd like, if it feels good. Most yoga studios, when we're trained as teachers, we're told that that is very weak language. You know, I've been told, like, my yoga teachers, like, you have to be more confident in your speaking. Like, when you use if you'd like, when you're ready, you give up your power. And I'm like, exactly. That's the point, right? I want my students. They're not even my students, right? I want my co-practitioners to feel like if they're not up for it, they don't have to do it, which has this incredible reverberation outside of the meditation hall, outside of the yoga studio. It builds this ability to decide for oneself how you want to respond to the ever-present onslaught of different social forces trying to encourage you not to feel that good about yourself.
Well, and I think you identified something that is so crucial around this question of how we support each other through healing, where it is this shift from even unintentional ways of using language, ways of giving praise for, supposed progress that is about an, ideal of perfection, rather than encouraging choice and empowerment of the students.
Yeah, and I have seen it for myself and I've experienced for myself. And when I've gone to yoga studios, I'm like, I'm not going to do that. But I felt forced to try, because if I didn't try, then I wouldn't be good enough. But now I'm like, no, that doesn't work for my body. And there's something really beneficial to be able to recognize that and also override that external discipline. Be like, nope, it doesn't work that way. So I'm going to do this instead.
Right. And there's a strength to what does it mean to support that internal discipline. And I think, this question of how do we support each other, it is changing our value system around that discipline and speaking about it, and even doing what you're doing in the face of suggestions that may override what you know to be true from a trauma informed perspective, and to maintain that. And I think that I have seen more and more conversations around trauma-informed yoga, around our clarity of language, and even around how we free ourselves from the expectation that we all have to conform to something that is not even necessarily realistic. And, we have a question from somebody watching right now. In what ways do you think the American media has played into this, eating and body image and maybe unrealistic expectations?
A lot. We've monetized body aesthetics, right? The wellness industry is like $52 billion a year. And capitalizing on our insecurities and there's ways in which social media is always projecting these kinds of images that are constructs, and we buy into them. The power of media is incredible. It can be used for great things, and it can also be used for insidious things. And the wellness industry does have a way of making you feel like garbage about yourself, but that if you buy this product, you'll feel better, right? So it's this kind of push-pull, and I recognize that. I see it. If I have too many things in my feed that are coming through and I recognize like, oh God, maybe I shouldn't do this, right? Why am I eating this? That's when it's a signal for myself to back off, because there's always going to be that kind of vulture waiting, to just get at you, to really take away our ability to feel good about ourselves. And to me, that is a political thing right there, is this unwillingness to give that ability and that capacity up. So yeah, to social media, all forms of media, there's a small wave of folks that are doing the opposite, which is really great.
Well, and we could say that right now, even this conversation, we're utilizing these platforms to maybe offer an alternate view, or to offer a critical discourse on we can make different choices, and we can use discipline differently, which brings us to another question that someone has asked. Can you share any tips for yoga teachers on how they might conduct a class that is sensitive to eating and body image sensitivities, that offers this this alternate view?
Yeah, that's a huge question, and there's so many great teachers out there training in this way. And I mean, I do think that some of the things that we can do are not personalize the practice.
Mm-hmm.
What I've seen in yoga classes are that certain bodies tend to get the attention,
Mm-hmm.
right? Get the praise. And as being one of those bodies that never got that praise in a yoga class, because I just can't do certain things, there's always this like sense that, oh, when you name somebody, it brings in that comparative mind,
Mm-hmm.
right? And all of a sudden, while in this potentially impossible posture, right? And it's a posture, and posturing is just so political too, to look over and suddenly think that you're supposed to look like that person. It takes the gaze off of the self,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I've seen like, oh, well, you can try over there and look at what Sally's doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very harmful,
Mm-hmm.
because suddenly everyone thinks that Sally is the norm.
Right.
And that norm is usually, again, that very narrow vision of what a yogi is supposed to be in American culture. And it doesn't really look like the rest of us. So that's just a short, small little tip. Yeah, and just very giving people the choice, right? If it feels good, give it a go. If not, don't worry about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that can be incredibly powerful, because you're like, oh, I don't have to do this, and I'm not a bad yogi if I don't do it.
Right.
So there's so much more there that we could get into, but I do think that there's a lot of movement towards more inclusive, trauma-informed practice that's out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really important, even for people to recognize that yoga doesn't have to be about building muscles at all. Everyone's always talking about like the yoga body. Like, well, what about the yoga heart? Like maybe there's a different way.
Oh, I love that so much. Thinking about the yoga heart, or thinking about what you were speaking of earlier, which is around the joyfulness. How do we have a sense of, or an experience of joy in our relationship to our body, and in our relationship with how we feed our body?
Yeah.
And we can look at the feeding of the body through food, but I think we can also look at the feeding of the body through practice.
Mm-hmm. And what we're allowing ourselves to bring in. Like, we're really good at controlling what food we eat. We're not as good at controlling what kinds of messaging we'll allow in. And I always think about the Buddhist concepts of the nutriments and the things that we bring into our mind, body, heart complex. There's physical, edible nutriments, and there's also sense impressions.
Mm-hmm.
And like, where's the discipline there? Meaning, where's the mindful awareness of what we're bringing in that's beneficial and wholesome and skillful, and what we're putting a boundary on.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking about those ways of how we feed ourselves, both physically and through imagery.
Mm-hmm.
Can we say no? Like, we're always taught to say no to dessert, which is ridiculous, right? Oh, say no to chocolate. Like, no, don't. That's where the problem is, right? Mm-hmm. The chocolate's not the problem. Food is just food. It's the moral value that we have placed on food. But where's the moral compass when it comes to what we're allowing into our senses, right? So there's a lot of ways in which, I tend to bring elements of Buddhist teaching and philosophy and elements of meditation and mindful eating together, because the effort to feel good about oneself takes more than just meditation it takes more than just a mindful eating. Like it includes all these different, it includes critical thinking, critical race theory, like all of these things as ways in which to battle against this constant onslaught, right? So sometimes you'll ask me, like, why do you do all these different things? I'm like, because there's multiple methods. There's not just one way, because this pervasive really assault on our bodies and white supremacist culture takes so much more. White supremacist patriarchal culture and all of its, manifestations. I feel like you need a lot of tools. Mm-hmm. Some of it's the critical thinking part, some of it's the embodiment part, and just what we choose to bring into our sense fields. Like it takes a village, right, to dismantle and to divest from these really powerful forces. Because it's never just going to a yoga class, because it's always related to social power, inequity, etc. And to be able to see those interlocking forces can be really beneficial.
And I think it's also, how do we encourage each other to continue to see them and to continue to validate this type of inquiry around them?
Yeah, absolutely. And also allow ourselves to screw up, allow ourselves a little bit of compassion when we're doing this, because I have students that, they'll come over and they'll be like, oh, I had such a hard, I ate the whole bag of chips and and I'm like, well, did you taste them? And they're like, didn't taste them. Were they good? And that's not what they're expecting. They're expecting moral judgment, right? I'm like, well, did you put them on a plate at least to acknowledge and to acknowledge that you had a desire and that you fed that desire? Because we're so used to pushing away the fact that we have these desires anyway, which is also connected to our ability to allow ourselves to experience joy and pleasure. Like I always tell my students, I'm like, if you want your chips and your ice cream, or maybe both, don't hide behind your refrigerator door, spooning one bit at a time and not being honest that you have a desire. Like acknowledge that we are full beings that have desire. Like be honest about it. Allow yourself to have it. And maybe that will take away some of the emotional charge. And they're always like, huh. And then they try it. And more often than not, they actually enjoy it more, because it's not a hidden secret thing. Right? There's many other things we probably, are that we hide, right, about what we've done, but eating ice cream shouldn't be one of them.
Well, and someone asked a question, and this is another kind of place where there could be a very long conversation around this, but another question that came in is around this moral, these moral judgment calls, that sometimes I feel insecure eating meat when I'm with my more serious yoga friends who argue that yogis must be vegetarian. Am I wrong?
To feel guilt? I've never felt guilt to be a very useful emotion, actually, because I think it can be a hindrance in the sense that we tend to focus so much on the guilt that we can't actually affect any change, because it becomes really about us, right? The question about meat eating it can be really tricky in the yoga world. And, all I can say is when I teach my classes, I actually we don't talk about meat eating or non-meat eating, because it is so emotionally rife and it's fraught. And so I do know in the yoga world, it can be pretty difficult. So I don't think you're wrong, because I don't do well with must. So I have my own preferences for how I eat and what I eat, but I never impose that on anybody else, because it's that obligatory disciplinary force again. I mean, this is a larger conversation, and also one that's really highly charged, and I get that, right? And there's also, the forces of orthorexia that are really quite prevalent in the yoga world as well. The sense that there are some foods that are good for you and some foods that you absolutely must not ever touch, like anything with a preservative in it. And again, we have this kind of fear mongering about what we feed ourselves. So it's a huge question that is political, it's social, there's so much to it. Food is
There's so
never
much to it. And
easy.
I think like you said too, when we talk about mindful eating as part of reclaiming a relationship with one's body that is in itself trauma informed, that in itself is choice based, then we can also look at what is someone's criteria for making decisions that have a number of different factors to them, which is around, religion and spirituality and moral choices and family background, right? There's, in that, what a yogic diet is, there's a lot to that. And there's also the questions of what it means for someone else to impose a judgment on another person versus making a moral decision that comes from within.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why I was so attracted to mindful eating, was because it didn't have anything to say about what kinds of foods we should or shouldn't eat. And the should or shouldn't eat list comes from a variety of different places. There's the religious, what you should or shouldn't eat. And then there's the diet industry, what you should or shouldn't eat. And then there's the cultural, what you should or shouldn't eat. So there's many different frameworks that have many different lists of do's and don'ts. And I think it depends on which list you're choosing for yourself. And sometimes they overlap and sometimes they don't. And it's a choice that we have to make for ourselves. And choices aren't always that easy.
No, and I think that this is a good place to kind of start to wrap. When we consider this, choices aren't always easy, but choice is the central piece of what you've talked about in terms of healing, empowerment, in terms of the intersection of Buddhist teachings and your work and things that you share in terms of your value system as a teacher.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm someone who has the benefit of having received formal training, but as a teacher, I'm always a student. And so that's one of the things I think that's really important also, is especially in the world of yoga. And I know we're running short on time, but yoga and contemporary mindfulness organizations in Buddhist temples is this really the elevating of the teacher above the student that can be quite harmful. And so I tend to think of myself as someone who's had the benefit of and the time to invest in a certain training, right? And I could share what's worked for me and the things that I've learned, but not from that elevated status as a teacher, because that also takes away from the student's ability to decide for themselves. When I'm a co-student who just happens to have a certification that, I took the time to do, then I can share what I've learned, but I'm not imposing that on anybody. And that's the Buddha way, right? It's like, oh, here's what I've discovered that was useful for me. Try it on, see if it works. If it doesn't, then don't worry about it. So, yeah.
Well, I think that's such an important message for this series, even Yoga in Our Time, is looking at the role of the teacher, and that it's not necessarily about elevating the teacher, but it's about elevating our own relationship with discipline, with embodiment, with listening, and even with mindfulness.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
do so from a place of the heart, right? I love what you spoke about, that developing the yogic heart, developing that gut instinct, and developing more joy.
Yeah.
So, uh, so Sharon, thank you for sharing your work and your perspectives and your thoughtfulness about how you have put your own practice into practice as a student, as a teacher, as a woman, as all of the above, as a scholar. And thank you for your books and your work and for sharing, this conversation and for sharing your work with yoga, mindfulness, and social change.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the workshop coming up. So thank you.
Mhm.